Today, we're delving into one of the most disturbing and complex aspects of the psychology of hedonistic killers, the interplay of sensory and sexual arousal. This category examines how certain individuals derive a perverse pleasure not just from the act of violence, but from the multifaceted sensory experiences that accompany their crimes. At its core, sensory and sexual arousal in hedonistic killers represents the fusion of violent behavior with a form of gratification that is both physical and psychological. For many of these offenders, the act of killing is not merely a means to an end. It is a highly charged sensory experience that engages their entire being. They experience a rush, a surge of adrenaline and endorphins that is so overwhelming that it becomes addictive. This physical response is often intertwined with sexual arousal, leading to behaviors that are both brutal and sexually charged. One of the primary drivers in this category is the intense physical arousal that comes from violence. When a hedonistic killer commits a violent act, the body responds as if it were engaged in an extreme athletic or survival activity. The sympathetic nervous system is activated, releasing adrenaline. This surge heightens the senses, sharpening vision, sound, and even touch. The offender may report a feeling of invincibility, where every sense is heightened and time seems to slow down. This adrenaline rush can be intoxicating, creating a high that reinforces the behavior. Imagine the scenario. As the act unfolds, the killer's heart pounds, blood circulates faster, and the very act of violence becomes an exhilarating performance. This physiological response is not solely about survival. It is experienced as pleasure. The individual begins to associate the act of violence with euphoria. Over time, the need to recreate that intense sensation becomes a driving force. In essence, the pleasure through violence transforms the criminal act into a self-reinforcing loop, a cycle where the physical high is the reward that compels repetition. Moving deeper, many hedonistic killers exhibit what psychologists refer to as paraphilic interests, atypical sexual urges that deviate from conventional norms. In this context, the line between violence and sexual arousal blurs. The act of killing is not just about inflicting pain. It becomes a deeply personal and sexual experience. For these individuals, the brutality of the crime is charged with eroticism. The violent act serves as a stimulus that triggers sexual arousal, often involving elements of domination, control, and humiliation. This confluence of violence and sexuality is complex. Paraphilic interests may manifest as an obsession with certain types of stimuli, whether they be visual, tactile, or even olfactory. For example, the sight of blood or the sound of a victim's screams might serve as a trigger that is as sexually exciting as any explicit image. The offender's fantasy world is one in which these arousing cues are elevated to the status of objects of desire. In their minds, the act of violence transforms ordinary physical sensations into a sexually charged experience. Furthermore, these individuals often develop intricate internal narratives where their actions are justified by their distorted sexual fantasies. In these narratives, their violent behavior is not merely a means of exerting power, it is an expression of their deepest, most perverse desires. The violence itself is ritualized, almost as if it were a performance designed to satisfy an internal script, a script that is heavily laden with sexual symbolism. Beyond the immediate rush and the blending with sexual arousal, there is also the role of sensory overstimulation. Hedonistic killers often report that the sensory details of a crime scene, whether it's the tactile sensation of blood, the auditory cacophony of a struggle, or the visual impact of a chaotic scene, play a crucial role in their experience of pleasure. Every sense is engaged, creating an overwhelming bombardment of stimuli that is both disorienting and deeply satisfying. This sensory overload can be understood through the lens of neurobiology. The brain's reward centers, particularly those involving dopamine, are activated by such intense sensory input. The more vivid and overwhelming the sensations, the greater the dopamine release, which reinforces the behavior. Essentially, the body is wired to seek out these intense experiences because they provide a neurochemical reward, a burst of pleasure that is hard to find in everyday life. For some offenders, the sensory aspects become ritualized. They might meticulously arrange the crime scene to maximize the sensory impact. The way a victim is positioned, the specific method used, even the environmental details like lighting or temperature, can all be manipulated to create an optimal state of overstimulation. This careful orchestration ensures that each subsequent act provides the same, if not heightened, level of sensory gratification. When we combine these elements, the adrenaline rush, the paraphilic integration of sexual arousal, and the overwhelming sensory stimulation, we begin to see how these factors create a potent, self-reinforcing cycle. Each act of violence that meets these criteria not only satisfies a short-term need, but also reinforces the neural pathways associated with pleasure. Over time, this cycle hardens in an addiction. The brain begins to crave not just the act of violence, but the full sensory and emotional experience that accompanies it. This craving pushes the individual to seek out opportunities for similar stimulation. The more they engage in these behaviors, the more their brain adapts to the heightened state, requiring even more extreme acts to achieve the same level of arousal and satisfaction. This cycle is similar in some respects to other forms of addiction. Just as a person might become dependent on a drug that floods their system with dopamine, a hedonistic offender becomes dependent on the neurochemical reward derived from sensory and sexual arousal. The intensity of the initial experience sets a benchmark that becomes increasingly difficult to reach, leading to escalation in both the frequency and the extremity of the violent acts. The category of sensory and sexual arousal in the profile of hedonistic killers is characterized by an intricate interplay of physiological, psychological, and neurobiological factors. These offenders derive an intense pleasure through violence, a pleasure that is marked by a rush of adrenaline and endorphins, a merging of sexual arousal with brutal acts, and a deliberate pursuit of sensory overstimulation. Together, these elements create a feedback loop that reinforces and escalates their behavior, making it not only a method of exerting control, but also a compulsive need driven by both body and mind. By understanding these mechanisms, law enforcement and psychological professionals can better appreciate the profound complexity of these crimes. It underscores the importance of early intervention and the development of specialized treatment protocols for individuals exhibiting such dangerous tendencies. Ultimately, the dark fusion of sensory pleasure and sexual gratification in violent acts provides a window into the disturbed inner world of hedonistic offenders, a world where the normal boundaries of human experience are not just blurred, but obliterated. The psychological realm of narcissism and grandiose self-concept as it appears in hedonistic offenders. This category is defined by an inflated sense of self-worth, an insatiable need for admiration, and a manipulative charm that allows these individuals to exert control over their victims and even the wider public. In understanding these dynamics, we gain insight into how these offenders validate their actions, justify their brutality, and maintain an ever-growing sense of superiority. At the heart of narcissism in hedonistic killers lies an overwhelming belief in their own superiority. These individuals often perceive themselves as unique and destined for greatness, a view that distorts their understanding of right and wrong. This inflated self-worth is not merely a matter of high self-esteem, it is a pathological condition where the killer sees no one as equal. They regard their violent actions as an expression of their exceptional nature, believing that they operate on a higher plane of existence than ordinary people. This sense of superiority serves several functions. First, it allows the offender to rationalize extreme behavior. When a killer believes that they are inherently better or more evolved than others, they can dismiss societal norms and moral constraints as irrelevant to their unique destiny. Their actions, however heinous, become a reaffirmation of their exceptionalism. In many cases, this self-concept is reinforced through a constant internal dialogue of self-praise. They construct elaborate narratives where every act of violence is portrayed as a necessary step in fulfilling their grand vision. In essence, the crime scene becomes a stage upon which they can display their power and excellence. Moreover, this inflated self-image is bolstered by selective memory and distorted self-reflection. When confronted with any form of criticism or evidence that might contradict their self-perception, these individuals are prone to dismiss or rationalize such feedback. Their inner world is one where they are the sole arbiters of value, and anyone who challenges that is either mistaken or irrelevant. This creates a feedback loop where each violent act further cements their self-perceived superiority, making it ever more difficult to break free from the cycle of destructive behavior. Another crucial component of the narcissistic profile in hedonistic killers is the insatiable need for admiration. These individuals do not merely seek validation in private, they crave public recognition, even if that recognition is derived from infamy. The act of violence is often staged not only as a means of control, but as a performance meant to capture the attention of others. They deliberately engage in actions that will set them apart from the masses, fueling a desire to be remembered, talked about, and feared. This need for admiration often manifests as a strategic pursuit of notoriety. Unlike many criminals who operate in secrecy, hedonistic killers may leave behind calling cards or symbols that hint at their involvement in a crime. Their aim is not solely to commit an offense, but to ensure that their name and image become etched in the public consciousness. This desire for recognition serves as both a reward and a motivator. When media outlets and law enforcement are forced to acknowledge their actions, the killer experiences a psychological rush akin to receiving applause. Even in the absence of positive feedback, the mere act of being the subject of widespread discussion feeds their ego and validates their self-image. Furthermore, this craving for admiration is intertwined with the concept of legacy. These individuals are often obsessed with how history will remember them. They construct elaborate personal mythologies where each act of violence is a chapter in their grand narrative. The ultimate goal is to be immortalized as someone who dared to break all the rules, a figure who redefined the boundaries of human behavior. This relentless pursuit of infamy reinforces their grandiose self-concept and provides a constant source of internal gratification. A striking trait often observed in hedonistic killers is their ability to wield manipulative charm. Despite the brutality of their actions, these individuals are frequently described as charismatic and engaging. Their charm is not an accidental byproduct, but a calculated tool that enables them to lure victims and manipulate those around them. This superficial allure is a critical aspect of their narcissistic makeup. It allows them to create a false persona that masks their true, darker nature. Manipulative charm operates on multiple levels. On a personal scale, it enables the offender to establish rapport with potential victims, drawing them in with promises of intimacy or trust. Once the victim is within their sphere of influence, the killer can then exploit that trust to exercise control. This dynamic is not limited to individual interactions. It also extends to the public and media. By presenting a well-groomed, confident exterior, these killers can shape public perception. They often portray themselves as misunderstood geniuses or as individuals driven to extremes by circumstances beyond their control, thereby deflecting criticism and fostering a perverse form of admiration. This charm is intricately linked with their self-perception. The ability to influence and control others serves as tangible proof of their superiority and validates their grandiose self-concept. In many cases, the act of manipulation is as much a part of their identity as the act of violence itself. It becomes a ritualistic performance, an essential ingredient in their psychological makeup that fuels both their personal satisfaction and the external validation they seek. The deceptive nature of their charm means that these individuals can easily transition between different social settings. In a professional environment, for instance, they might be the epitome of confidence and competence, masking their internal void with charm and wit. However, once in a more private or controlled setting, the facade drops, revealing the darker impulses that drive their violent behavior. This duality is a hallmark of narcissistic pathology and highlights the complexity of their psychological profile. When these elements, inflated self-worth, an insatiable need for admiration, and manipulative charm, come together, they create a potent psychological force that underpins the behavior of hedonistic killers. This integration of traits not only defines their internal world, but also shapes their actions in the external realm. The narcissistic self becomes a driving engine that propels them to commit acts of extreme violence as a means of affirming their identity. In practice, this means that every act of violence is both a personal and public statement. It is an assertion of their superiority, a deliberate performance aimed at securing admiration, and a calculated demonstration of control. The public spectacle of their crimes serves to reinforce their internal narrative of exceptionalism. Each violent act is, in essence, a carefully choreographed event designed to validate their grandiose self-concept and to etch their legacy into the annals of infamy. Understanding this integration is critical for both psychological profiling and law enforcement investigations. Recognizing that these offenders are driven not solely by impulse, but by a deep-seated need to be admired and remembered can help in predicting their behavior. Their actions are not random. They are part of a broader narrative where each crime is a deliberate step towards self-aggrandizement. This insight is invaluable when constructing profiles that aim to predict future behaviors or to understand the underlying motivations of these dangerous individuals. The psychological focus on narcissism and grandiose self-concept in hedonistic killers reveals a dark fusion of self-obsession and violent expression. The inflated self-worth of these individuals provides the foundation upon which they build their identity, while their insatiable need for admiration drives them to seek public recognition and infamy. Their manipulative charm serves as a tool for both luring victims and controlling public perception, reinforcing their belief in their own superiority. Together, these factors create a complex and dangerous psychological profile. The crimes committed by hedonistic killers are not merely acts of violence. They are expressions of a deeply ingrained need to validate an inflated self-image and to secure a legacy of notoriety. By understanding these elements, mental health professionals and law enforcement can develop more effective strategies for predicting, identifying, and ultimately intervening in the behaviors of those who operate under such a distorted sense of self. The dark allure of narcissism in this context lies in its power to transform everyday violence into a perverse form of art, a performance where every act is both a personal triumph and a public spectacle. Recognizing and unraveling this intricate web of psychological needs is crucial in the broader endeavor to understand, prevent, and treat the behaviors that define hedonistic killers. A chilling yet essential aspect of the hedonistic killer's psyche: fantasy immersion and dissociative tendencies. This category delves into how some violent offenders escape into elaborate inner worlds and, through dissociation, detach themselves from the full emotional and moral weight of their actions. By understanding these processes, we can gain insight into the dangerous blend of fantasy and reality that fuels extreme behavior. Many hedonistic killers create and live in intricate fantasy realms that serve as both a playground and a justification for their violent acts. In these inner worlds, the boundaries between reality and imagination blur, allowing the individual to live out perverse desires without the constraints of societal norms. This immersive fantasy life is not a mere escape. It becomes a powerful lens through which they view themselves and the world. These fantasies can be as complex as a detailed script, complete with characters, narratives, and even missions, all designed to elevate the self and rationalize brutality. Simultaneously, dissociative tendencies enable these offenders to detach from their immediate experiences. Dissociation is a psychological process where an individual separates themselves from the normal integration of thoughts, feelings, or memories. For hedonistic killers, this means they can enact violent fantasies without feeling the emotional burden typically associated with such acts. This combination of fantasy immersion and dissociation creates a double layer of detachment, making it easier for them to cross moral and legal boundaries. The process of fantasy immersion begins with the creation of an elaborate internal world. These individuals construct detailed narratives that often serve as a blueprint for their actions. In this internal theater, they are the heroes or gods of their own story, a stark contrast to the powerless or victimized roles they may have experienced in life. This fantasy world provides a sense of order and purpose, allowing them to reinterpret painful experiences or perceive slights as fuel for their grand mission. For many hedonistic killers, these fantasies are saturated with themes of power, control, and retribution. The fantasy narrative might involve a heroic quest against perceived societal wrongs or a personal crusade against individuals who represent weakness. In their minds, every act of violence is an enactment of these deeply held beliefs. The fantasy world becomes a sanctuary where they can explore forbidden desires and validate their self-worth, free from the judgment of the outside world. Moreover, these internal narratives are not static. They evolve over time. As the killer commits more violent acts, these actions become incorporated into their fantasy narrative, reinforcing and expanding the storyline. Each act of brutality is a chapter that boosts their self-image, confirming their perceived superiority and unique destiny. This dynamic process creates a feedback loop where the fantasy not only justifies but also compels further violent behavior. Closely linked to fantasy immersion are dissociative tendencies, an essential mechanism that allows these individuals to compartmentalize their inner experiences. Dissociation is a defense mechanism that protects the individual from psychological pain or overwhelming stimuli. For hedonistic killers, dissociation means that the intense emotions typically associated with violent acts are muted or even entirely absent. This detachment provides them with the emotional distance necessary to carry out acts that would otherwise be unbearable. In practical terms, dissociation manifests as a feeling of being outside oneself. During the commission of a crime, the killer might experience a surreal sense of watching the events unfold rather than being an active participant. This detachment can lead to memory gaps, where the details of the crime become fuzzy or distorted over time. The mind, in effect, shields itself from the horror of the act by relegating it to a separate mental compartment. This dissociative state not only reduces emotional pain, but also facilitates the transition from fantasy to action. By dissociating from reality, the offender can operate in a space where the lines between their imagined scenarios and the real world blur. This mental separation allows them to enact their fantasies with minimal internal resistance. The violent act is no longer experienced as an emotionally charged event, but rather as a mechanical execution of a pre-written script. Dissociation also plays a role in long-term identity formation. Over time, the repeated use of dissociation can lead to a fragmented sense of self. The individual may come to view their violent persona as separate from their normal self, further reducing the psychological barriers that might otherwise inhibit extreme behavior. This fragmentation reinforces the cycle of violence, as the dissociated parts of the self can operate independently of the moral and emotional constraints that bind the integrated self. The integration of fantasy immersion and dissociative tendencies creates a potent psychological profile. On one hand, the killer lives in a rich, detailed internal world that provides both a narrative for their actions and a justification for their brutality. On the other hand, dissociation ensures that the emotional impact of these actions is minimized, allowing them to execute violent fantasies without the usual psychological cost. In the real world, this integration manifests in several ways. First, the offender may meticulously plan their crimes, aligning the execution with the specific details of their internal fantasy. The crime scene is treated as a stage set to mirror their imagined scenarios. Every detail is carefully arranged to recreate the sensory and emotional components of their fantasy, reinforcing the cycle of immersion. Second, the dissociative aspect ensures that the killer does not experience the full moral weight of their actions. This emotional numbing makes it possible to commit multiple crimes without the paralyzing effects of guilt or remorse. The offender can continue to build upon their fantasy narrative, each act further entrenching the dissociation between their violent self and any residual sense of morality. Furthermore, the interplay between fantasy and dissociation allows these individuals to adapt and escalate their behavior over time. As the internal narrative grows more complex and the dissociative mechanisms become more deeply ingrained, the threshold for what constitutes sufficient stimulation increases. This escalation means that over time, the offender may seek out increasingly extreme experiences to achieve the same level of arousal and fulfillment, further distancing themselves from societal norms. The psychological focus on fantasy immersion and dissociative tendencies in hedonistic killers reveals a dark synergy where elaborate internal worlds and emotional detachment merge to facilitate extreme behavior. These individuals construct detailed fantasy narratives that serve as both a justification for and a blueprint of their violent actions. Simultaneously, dissociative tendencies provide the necessary emotional insulation, allowing them to execute these fantasies without the burden of overwhelming guilt or psychological pain. This dual process is a critical component in understanding the pathology of hedonistic killers. The inner world they create not only drives their actions, but also reinforces their self-perception as exceptional and untouchable. By disconnecting from reality, they can operate in a space where their fantasies come alive and where every violent act becomes a self-validating performance. Recognizing the interplay between fantasy immersion and dissociation is essential for developing effective psychological profiles and intervention strategies. Understanding this dangerous synergy is not merely an academic exercise, it is a vital step in identifying, predicting, and ultimately intervening in the behaviors of individuals who are capable of extreme violence. The dark fusion of a vivid inner fantasy life with the protective mechanism of dissociation makes these offenders uniquely formidable. Only by unraveling these complex psychological layers can we hope to mitigate the risks they pose to society. The most fascinating yet disturbing aspects of the criminal mind, the interplay of ritualization, meticulous planning, and neurobiological reinforcement in hedonistic killers. This segment of the psychological profile reveals how offenders transform acts of violence into carefully orchestrated performances. Their behavior is not random or impulsive. Instead, it is a calculated ritualistic process powered by neurobiological mechanisms that reinforce and escalate their actions. In this script, we will explore this phenomenon in detail, breaking down the subject into its key components and examining how each contributes to the cycle of violence. At the outset, it is essential to recognize that for many hedonistic killers, violent behavior transcends mere criminal activity. It becomes a ritualistic performance. These individuals convert their acts of brutality into elaborate ceremonies, where every detail is imbued with meaning and serves to affirm their identity. Rather than acting on mere impulse, they invest extensive time and energy into planning each step, meticulously orchestrating their actions to not only inflict harm, but also to extract maximum sensory and emotional gratification. This process of ritualization is driven by a desire for control and mastery. In the chaotic world of criminal activity, the act of planning and executing a violent ritual provides a structured outlet for their inner turmoil. It transforms the act of killing from a random outburst into a deliberate, almost sacred event, where every movement, sound, and sight contributes to a larger narrative. Over time, this ritualistic behavior becomes deeply ingrained, reinforced by both psychological satisfaction and neurobiological rewards. Ritualization begins with the construction of a symbolic framework. Offenders often create personal mythologies, where every violent act is a chapter in an epic narrative. This narrative is laden with symbolism. Each element of the crime scene, from the positioning of the victim to the choice of weapon, is selected for its emotional and symbolic resonance. The ritual becomes a language through which the killer communicates not only with the world, but also with their own inner self. For example, a killer might choose a specific location because it holds personal significance or because it mirrors a scene from a fantasy they have long nurtured. The arrangement of objects at the scene, the placement of personal belongings, the deliberate disorder can be seen as a form of expression, conveying messages that only the offender fully understands. This symbolic layer not only enhances the emotional impact of the crime, but also serves to solidify the killer's self-concept as someone who exists on a different plane from ordinary people. Once a symbolic framework is established, the next step is repetition. Much like religious rituals, the repetition of certain actions reinforces their significance. With each act of violence that mirrors the established pattern, the killer experiences a reaffirmation of their internal narrative. This repetition creates a feedback loop. The more the ritual is enacted, the more it becomes embedded in the offender's psyche. Over time, these repeated actions evolve into a sort of signature or modus operandi. Investigators may eventually recognize these patterns as hallmarks of a particular killer. However, for the offender, the signature is a deeply personal mark, a badge of honor that differentiates their work from that of lesser individuals. The ritual becomes a ritualistic performance that feeds their ego and sustains their sense of superiority. In essence, the ritual is not only a means to commit a crime, but also a method of self-validation. The power of ritual lies in its ability to evoke intense emotional responses. When a killer engages in ritualized behavior, the act transcends the physical realm and enters the domain of the symbolic. The emotions elicited during the ritual, ranging from exhilaration to a cold sense of detachment, are integral to the offender's experience. This emotional charge is critical. It transforms the act of killing into a deeply felt performance that resonates on both personal and neurobiological levels. This reward, in turn, drives the offender to continue refining their methods, perpetuating the cycle of planning, execution, and reinforcement. Central to the concept of neurobiological reinforcement is the role of the brain's dopaminergic reward system. Dopamine, a neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward, plays a critical role in reinforcing behaviors that the brain perceives as beneficial. In the context of ritualized violence, the process of planning and executing a meticulously orchestrated crime triggers significant dopamine release. This surge creates a powerful sense of pleasure and satisfaction, which the brain then associates with the violent act. For hedonistic killers, this dopamine-driven reward system is essentially hijacked. The anticipation of a violent ritual, the detailed execution, and even the aftermath of the act combine to produce a neurochemical response that is both immediate and long-lasting. This reward response is what makes the cycle of violence self-perpetuating. Each successful act of violence becomes a neurobiological trigger that compels the offender to seek out similar experiences in the future. Over time, repeated activation of the brain's reward circuits leads to neuroplastic changes. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to adapt and reorganize itself in response to repeated stimuli. In the case of hedonistic killers, the repeated experience of dopamine surges during ritualized violence causes the neural pathways associated with these behaviors to become more deeply entrenched. This process makes the behavior habitual as the brain begins to prioritize and seek out the experiences that trigger these neurochemical rewards. This reinforcement is critical in understanding why such behavior becomes increasingly difficult to change. As the neural pathways strengthen, the offender's brain becomes wired to respond automatically to the cues associated with violence. The rituals, the planning, and the environmental manipulations all serve as triggers for these deep-seated neural responses. Consequently, even in the absence of external rewards, the internal neurobiological drive can compel the individual to engage in violent behavior again and again. The process of planning and executing a violent ritual is not only rewarding, but also inherently stressful. However, for these offenders, stress and arousal work in tandem to enhance the overall experience. Acute stress leads to the release of cortisol, a hormone that, in controlled amounts, can actually heighten alertness and focus. In the context of a well-planned violent act, this stress response may synergize with the dopaminergic reward system, creating a heightened state of arousal that further amplifies the pleasure derived from the act. This interaction between stress and arousal is critical in explaining the intensity of the experience. The controlled stress response not only sharpens the offender's cognitive and sensory functions, but also primes the brain for an even greater dopamine release upon successful execution of the ritual. The result is a powerful, almost addictive state where the offender is driven by both the anticipation of reward and the desire to overcome the inherent tension of the planning process. As the cycle of ritualization, planning, and violent execution continues, the offender's neurobiology undergoes long-term adaptations. These adaptations manifest as an increased tolerance for the neurochemical rewards. Over time, the same level of stimulation produces a diminished response. This tolerance drives the individual to escalate their behavior, seeking out ever more extreme experiences to achieve the same level of satisfaction. This escalation is a hallmark of neurobiological reinforcement. The brain's adaptation to repeated dopamine surges means that the baseline state of pleasure shifts, and the offender must engage in increasingly intense rituals to reach the desired emotional high. This progressive escalation not only makes the behavior more dangerous, but also further entrenches the cycle, as the offender's neurobiology becomes increasingly dependent on the violent rituals to function normally. When the elements of ritualization, meticulous planning, and neurobiological reinforcement converge, they form a potent, self-perpetuating cycle that is at the core of hedonistic killer behavior. The process begins with the careful construction of a symbolic, ritualistic framework that transforms violence into an art form. This framework is then meticulously planned and executed, with every detail engineered to maximize both tactical efficiency and symbolic impact. The act of executing this plan triggers a neurochemical reward, a surge of dopamine, that reinforces the behavior and primes the brain for future acts. Over time, these processes interact in a way that blurs the lines between fantasy and reality, making it nearly impossible for the offender to detach from the cycle. The neurobiological adaptations that occur with repeated violence not only reinforce the existing patterns, but also drive the offender toward ever more extreme behavior. This dangerous synergy explains why interventions for such individuals are so challenging and why the cycle of violence can escalate rapidly once initiated. Understanding this intricate interplay is crucial for law enforcement and mental health professionals alike. By recognizing that the behavior of hedonistic killers is deeply rooted in both psychological constructs and neurobiological processes, investigators can develop more nuanced profiles and more effective intervention strategies. It becomes clear that these violent acts are not merely impulsive outbursts, but are the culmination of a complex, orchestrated process designed to satisfy deeply embedded psychological needs. The combined forces of ritualization, meticulous planning, and neurobiological reinforcement create a formidable engine that drives the violent behavior of hedonistic killers. The ritualization process transforms acts of violence into symbolic performances, while the detailed planning ensures that every element of the crime is executed with precision. These actions, in turn, activate the brain's reward system, reinforcing the behavior and paving the way for long-term neurobiological adaptations. Over time, this cycle escalates, making it an insidious and self-sustaining pattern of behavior. By exploring these dimensions in depth, we not only gain insight into the workings of a disturbed mind, but also equip ourselves with the knowledge needed to predict, prevent, and ultimately intervene in such cases. Understanding the dark synergy of ritualization, planning, and neurobiological reinforcement is a vital step in combating the menace posed by these offenders. It reminds us that violence, when combined with psychological obsession and biological reinforcement, can evolve into a ritual that transcends ordinary criminality, becoming a compulsive need that is both terrifying and profoundly difficult to break. This exploration underscores the importance of integrated approaches that combine psychological evaluation with an understanding of neurobiological mechanisms. Only through such comprehensive analysis can we hope to unravel the complexities of these behaviors and develop strategies that disrupt the cycle of violence before it escalates further. In the study of hedonistic killers, one of the most compelling aspects is the transformation of violent acts into ritualistic performances. These individuals do not merely commit crimes on impulse. They engage in extensive planning, create symbolic and highly structured rituals, and experience significant neurobiological reinforcement that drives them to repeat their behavior. This complex interplay, where every act is both a carefully choreographed event and a source of intense internal reward, offers key insights into the mind of the offender. Two of the most infamous examples of hedonistic killers who illustrate these dynamics are Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. Despite the differences in their backgrounds and modus operandi, both exhibited profound ritualization and planning in their crimes, as well as neurobiological responses that reinforce their violent behavior. Yet their profiles also reveal critical vulnerabilities and present unique challenges for police investigations. In the following sections, we'll examine how each killer's behavior aligns with the psychological mechanisms of ritualization, meticulous planning, and neurobiological reinforcement, while also exploring the weaknesses in their methods and the hurdles law enforcement encountered in bringing them to justice. Ted Bundy is perhaps one of the most notorious names in American criminal history. His crimes were characterized not only by their brutality, but also by the manner in which they were meticulously planned and ritualized. Bundy carefully crafted a personal narrative in which each crime was an extension of his self-image as an extraordinary and powerful individual. He viewed the act of violence as a performance, one that allowed him to assert his superiority and control. Bundy's ritualization began long before the crime occurred. He would select locations that enhanced his sense of power, often isolated areas where he felt less likely to be interrupted or detected. Every element of his approach, from the method of luring his victims to the careful management of his environment, was part of a self-imposed ritual. This ritual was imbued with symbolic meaning. It served as a testament to his belief that he was different from ordinary people, destined for a larger, albeit darker, purpose. Bundy's crimes were not acts of random violence. They were the product of detailed planning. His approach was systematic. He observed potential victims, identified patterns in behavior, and tailored his methods to each situation. This planning process not only reduced the risk of immediate detection, but also created a framework that allowed him to derive pleasure from the act. The anticipation of the crime, the execution of his carefully laid plans, and the subsequent success of the act all triggered a powerful neurobiological response. This response, largely mediated by the brain's reward circuitry and the release of dopamine, reinforced his behavior. Each successful crime provided Bundy with a sense of euphoria, a confirmation that his methods worked and that he was in control. Over time, these dopamine surges became addictive. The more he planned and executed his violent rituals, the stronger his internal need grew for the high associated with perfect execution. His behavior escalated in a way that was self-perpetuating. The satisfaction of one act laid the groundwork for increasingly elaborate schemes. A key component in Bundy's psychological profile was his pronounced narcissism and grandiose self-concept. He maintained an inflated sense of self-worth that allowed him to rationalize his actions as expressions of his superiority. This self-belief was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it fueled his meticulous planning and his confidence in evading capture. On the other, it became a vulnerability. His overconfidence sometimes led him to take risks that ultimately contributed to his downfall. Bundy's charm was legendary. He possessed a disarming, attractive persona that made him appear trustworthy and even appealing to those around him. This charm was not accidental. It was a strategic tool that helped him lure victims and avoid suspicion. Yet his ability to present a polished exterior made it challenging for police to identify him as a dangerous criminal. Law enforcement initially struggled because Bundy did not fit the stereotypical image of a violent offender. His smooth talk, good looks, and articulate manner masked the ritualized planning and internal chaos driving his actions. Bundy's carefully constructed facade posed significant challenges for investigators. His ability to blend into society, to appear as an ordinary, even charming individual, allowed him to evade early detection. Police were often misled by his normalcy. He did not exhibit the outward signs of instability that might trigger immediate concern. Instead, Bundy's crimes unfolded in a manner that was both deliberate and calculated, leaving little evidence of impulsivity. Furthermore, his ritualization and planning meant that his methods evolved over time, making it difficult for authorities to pinpoint a consistent modus operandi. Each crime was unique in its setting and execution, though underlying patterns did exist. This variability, combined with his capacity for manipulation, often left investigators with fragmented clues rather than a coherent profile. It was only through a painstaking process of pattern recognition and the eventual linking of disparate crimes that Bundy's true nature began to emerge. Ted Bundy's case illustrates the dark synergy between ritualization, meticulous planning, and neurobiological reinforcement. His crimes were highly structured performances that not only fulfilled his internal fantasies of power and control, but also provided a neurochemical reward that drove him to continue. His vulnerabilities, namely his narcissism and overconfidence, eventually became critical in the investigative process, even as his charming exterior initially misled law enforcement. Jeffrey Dahmer is another infamous figure whose actions have been extensively analyzed through the lens of hedonistic killer psychology. Unlike Bundy, Dahmer's crimes were marked by a deep immersion in his own internal fantasies. Dahmer constructed a detailed internal narrative that was steeped in themes of control and the fulfillment of perverse desires. In his mind, every act of violence was not simply a physical act, but a necessary step in realizing an elaborate fantasy. A fantasy that allowed him to explore the boundaries between power, desire, and control. Dahmer's fantasy immersion was evident in the way he meticulously planned his actions. He developed a personal mythology in which each violent act served to validate his internal narrative. His fantasies provided a blueprint for his behavior, and the act of committing these crimes was an enactment of a script that had been evolving in his mind for years. This internal world was rich in detail and allowed him to rationalize his behavior as a necessary expression of his inner self, rather than as a deviation from social norms. Central to Dahmer's psychological profile were his dissociative tendencies, which allowed him to detach emotionally from his actions. Dissociation provided Dahmer with a psychological escape, a way to separate his internal fantasy from the reality of his actions. When he committed his crimes, Dahmer often described a feeling of detachment, as if he were observing the events from a distance rather than participating in them fully. This dissociation was a critical coping mechanism. It muted the emotional impact of his actions and reduced the internal conflict that might otherwise arise from such extreme behavior. In doing so, it allowed him to continue his violent rituals without the burden of overwhelming guilt or remorse. The dissociative state not only reinforced his commitment to his internal narrative, but also made it more difficult for him to confront the reality of his behavior. Dahmer's approach to his crimes also featured significant elements of ritualization and planning. Although his behavior often appeared reclusive and unassuming, he was remarkably methodical in preparing his crimes. Dahmer would choose locations that provided privacy and control, carefully arranging the environment to suit the needs of his fantasy. This planning extended to every detail, from the timing of his actions to the manner in which he manipulated his surroundings, ensuring that the experience matched the intricate script laid out in his mind. The ritualized nature of his behavior provided a sense of consistency and predictability, both for himself and eventually for investigators. However, much like Bundy, Dahmer's ability to orchestrate his crimes in a highly controlled manner also made him a challenging subject for law enforcement. His actions were executed with precision, and his focus on environmental manipulation meant that there were often few obvious signs of a broader pattern. His careful planning allowed him to operate under the radar for an extended period, and his quiet, unassuming presence in his community further contributed to the difficulty in identifying him as a threat. The meticulous planning and ritualization of Dahmer's crimes were reinforced by neurobiological mechanisms similar to those observed in other hedonistic killers. The anticipation of executing his fantasy, combined with the act itself, triggered a surge in dopamine, a powerful neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward. This neurochemical reinforcement played a pivotal role in sustaining his behavior over time. Each successful act served to strengthen the neural pathways associated with violence, creating an increasingly compelling drive to repeat the behavior. Over time, Dahmer's threshold for stimulation increased. The same level of ritualized violence no longer produced the desired neurochemical response, leading him to escalate his behavior in order to achieve the same level of internal gratification. This escalation is a common feature in cases of neurobiological reinforcement, as the brain adapts to repeated stimuli by requiring ever more intense experiences to trigger the same level of pleasure. For Dahmer, this meant that his crimes became progressively more elaborate and, in some ways, more difficult to detect as isolated incidents. One of the most significant challenges police faced in identifying Jeffrey Dahmer was his ability to present an outward appearance of normalcy. Dahmer was known for his quiet, unassuming demeanor, which allowed him to blend into his community with ease. Unlike more flamboyant offenders, his behavior did not immediately arouse suspicion. Neighbors and acquaintances described him as shy and reserved, a stark contrast to the violent acts he was capable of. This gap between appearance and behavior is a hallmark of many hedonistic killers. Dahmer's dissociative tendencies and internal fantasy immersion meant that he did not display the overtly erratic or aggressive behaviors that might tip off authorities. Instead, his meticulous planning and controlled execution of his crimes enabled him to operate covertly for years. Law enforcement officials, when investigating missing persons or other related issues, often did not suspect Dahmer due to his subdued public persona. His ability to compartmentalize his life into a normal front and a hidden violent inner world made it exceptionally challenging for police to piece together the broader pattern of his behavior. Furthermore, the ritualized nature of Dahmer's crimes meant that while patterns existed, they were often subtle and required careful, long-term investigation to uncover. His use of environmental manipulation and the strategic timing of his actions led to a fragmented set of clues that did not immediately suggest the presence of a serial offender. In Dahmer's case, by the time law enforcement recognized the recurring elements of his behavior, he had already established a well-entrenched cycle that was difficult to disrupt. While Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer both exemplify the principles of ritualization, meticulous planning, and neurobiological reinforcement, they do so in distinct ways that reflect their individual psychological makeups. Bundy's approach was characterized by overt charm, strategic planning, and a confident self-assurance that allowed him to manipulate those around him easily. His crimes were high-profile, and his calculated public persona masked the dark rituals underlying his actions. Bundy's narcissism and grandiosity not only fueled his planning, but also became a vulnerability. His overconfidence occasionally led to miscalculations that ultimately aided investigators in linking disparate crimes to a single offender. Dahmer's profile, in contrast, was marked by a profound internalization of violent fantasy and a tendency toward dissociation. His crimes were executed with quiet precision, and his unassuming public demeanor belied the complexity of his internal world. Dahmer's ability to detach emotionally from his actions allowed him to sustain a long period of undetected criminal behavior. However, the same dissociation contributed to an escalating need for more intense stimulation, leading him down an ever-escalating path that eventually caught the attention of law enforcement. Both offenders exploited their ability to manage their internal states, Bundy through his charismatic manipulation and Dahmer through his dissociative compartmentalization, to create environments in which their violent acts were not only possible, but also profoundly reinforcing on a neurobiological level. Yet their different external presentations posed unique challenges for police. Bundy's charm led investigators astray by making him appear non-threatening, while Dahmer's quiet nature allowed him to operate beneath the radar for an extended period. These differences underscore the importance of understanding the full spectrum of psychological mechanisms at play in hedonistic killers. The concepts of ritualization, planning, and neurobiological reinforcement offer a critical framework for understanding the behaviors of hedonistic killers, such as Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. Bundy's calculated charm and meticulous planning, combined with neurobiological rewards that reinforced his violent rituals, allowed him to craft a public persona that masked his inner darkness, a factor that significantly complicated police efforts to identify him. On the other hand, Dahmer's deep immersion in a personal fantasy world, coupled with dissociative tendencies and highly controlled, ritualized behavior, enabled him to maintain a covert criminal life despite operating within a seemingly normal social environment. The challenges for law enforcement in both cases were profound. Bundy's outward normalcy and manipulative charisma often led investigators to underestimate the threat he posed, while Dahmer's quiet reclusiveness and ability to compartmentalize his violent behavior made his crimes appear as isolated incidents rather than part of a coherent serial pattern. In each instance, the offender's internal reinforcement mechanisms, driven by dopamine surges in the neuroplastic changes resulting from repeated violent rituals, ensured that their behavior became deeply ingrained and progressively harder to detect and disrupt. Understanding these psychological and neurobiological processes is crucial for developing more effective profiling techniques and intervention strategies. By recognizing the subtle signals of ritualization and the signs of neurobiological reinforcement, law enforcement can better anticipate the escalation of such behavior and implement measures to identify these dangerous individuals sooner. Ultimately, the cases of Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer remind us that behind the facade of normalcy, there can exist a meticulously orchestrated inner world, where violence is not an aberration, but a calculated, ritualistic performance. A performance that is as much about self-affirmation and internal reward as it is about the infliction of harm. Addressing these challenges requires a holistic approach that integrates psychological insights with advanced investigative techniques, ensuring that the full complexity of the criminal mind is brought to light before the cycle of violence escalates beyond control.